The minus 12 degrees Celsius air didn't bite half as hard as the laughter echoing from behind the door that had just been locked in my face. Daniel stood there, his hand entwined with his young assistant's, looking at me through the glass as if I were a pet that needed breaking. "Stay out there until you learn how to respect your future husband," he sneered. Inside, the gala roared on. Crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne bottles I had personally selected were being raised to toast his success. They stood in the golden glow of the fireplace while I stood in the heart of a blizzard in a silk slip dress, a public laughingstock for the elite on New Year's Eve. But Daniel made a fatal mistake. He thought he was locking a submissive wife out of his home. He had no idea I had been waiting for this exact moment for 8 long months. Through the blinding white snow, a midnight black limousine glided up the driveway like a silent predator. The door swung open, but the man who stepped out wasn't there to rescue me. He was there to serve a sentence. Don't turn away, because this isn't just a story about a cheap affair. This is a masterclass in revenge that I have calculated down to the very last move. If you stay until the end, you will watch Daniel lose everything, his home, his career, and his dignity, all within the next 60 minutes. The snow is falling hard tonight, but my heart is colder and more ruthless than this winter could ever dream to be. My name is Brooke Sterling, and I am 37 years old. At an age where many are still struggling to find their footing, I have already secured my place as a senior professor of economics and a strategic consultant for major asset funds. My career is built on the cold analysis of value, how it is formed, how it functions, and how easily it collapses due to a single catastrophic decision. My life has been a series of calculated risks, but Daniel was the one variable I allowed myself to believe was a safe investment. The biting cold of this New Year's Eve felt like a physical assault, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the gala occurring just inches away behind the double-paned glass. I stood on the stone porch of the sprawling suburban estate, my breath escaping in silver plumes of mist. The temperature had plummeted to minus 12 degrees Celsius. In my thin emerald silk slip dress, I should have been terrified. I should have been pounding on the door, screaming for mercy, or weeping with the shame of being discarded in front of the very people I had helped Daniel impress. But as I watched Daniel through the glass, his face twisted in a smug, self-righteous sneer as he whispered something to Alyssa that made her giggle. My heart didn't break. It solidified. This was the final data point in a long, grueling audit of his character. I wasn't shivering from the shock of betrayal. I was shivering because the man I almost married had just handed me the final evidence I needed to ruin him. Daniel's voice had carried through the heavy wood, just moments before the deadbolt clicked with a hollow finality. He told me to wait out here until I learned respect, a word he used as a weapon to demand total submissiveness. He thought he was the lion tamer and I was the beast that needed to be starved into compliance. What he failed to realize was that I was the one who had built the cage. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out my phone. My fingers were stiff, but my mind was laser-focused. I didn't open my contacts to call him. Instead, I accessed the estate's smart home management app. With a few precise taps, I bypassed his administrative access, a backdoor I had installed months ago, and deactivated the house's entire HVAC system. I watched through the window as the soft hum of the vents died out. Within 20 minutes, the investors in their tuxedos and Alyssa in her backless gown would begin to feel the creeping skeletal hand of the winter draft. While they toasted with my champagne, the heat would die, leaving them in a tomb of their own making. The humiliation was supposed to be mine, but as I stood there, I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. I had spent 8 months watching Daniel's ego swell like a terminal bruise. I had seen the way he looked at my academic achievements with resentment, and the way he looked at Alyssa with the hunger of a man who wanted a trophy, not a partner. I had purposefully delayed signing our final marriage license and the updated prenuptial agreement citing legal due diligence. Daniel thought I was merely a perfectionist. In reality, I was giving him one last chance to prove he was the man he promised to be. By locking that door tonight, he didn't just exclude me from a party. He effectively signed his own financial death warrant. He had failed the stress test. Light suddenly flooded the snowy driveway as a midnight black limousine turned onto the property, its tires crunching softly over the fresh white powder. It wasn't a taxi or a concerned friend. As the door opened, a man in a crisp wool overcoat stepped out, not to rescue a damsel, but to report to a superior. It was Arthur, my family's private attorney, accompanied by Margaret, the chairperson of the university board where I worked. They didn't look at the house with admiration. They looked at it with the clinical boredom of people who owned much larger ones. Margaret stepped toward me, draping a heavy cashmere coat over my shoulders, her eyes burning with a silent, fierce understanding. She didn't ask if I was okay. She handed me a leather-bound folder containing the official offer for the dean's seat and a senior partnership at the investment fund. The contrast was almost poetic. Inside that house, Daniel was playing King of the Hill with amateur speculators and borrowed prestige. Out here in the freezing dark, the real world of old money and permanent power was waiting to take me home. I looked at the house one last time, seeing the frost already beginning to pattern the edges of the windows now that the heat had failed. Daniel was inside, likely toasting to his dominance, unaware that the very roof over his head was held in a trust he could no longer access. This night was never about his power. It was about my liberation. I had staged this final audition, and Daniel had performed exactly as I feared he would. As I stepped into the warmth of the limousine, leaving the suburban facade behind, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. As the limo door clicked shut, I realized something colder than the winter air I had just witnessed the last audition of a man who failed the role of my husband. The hum of the limousine's engine was a low, expensive purr that acted as a sanctuary, shielding me from the brutal reality of the wind chill. As I leaned my head back against the leather seat, the flickering lights of the suburban estate grew smaller in the distance, and my mind drifted back to the roots of my caution. My father was a man of immense brilliance and even greater kindness, a combination that proved fatal in the shark-infested waters of the 1990s real estate market. I still remember the day his charming business partner, a man who had sat at our dinner table and toasted to our family's health, vanished with 60% of the firm's liquidity, leaving my father to face the creditors alone. I watched a titan of industry shrink into a shadow of himself, burdened by debts that weren't his all because he had traded his vigilance for the warmth of a handshake. My mother, who spent the next decade meticulously rebuilding our lives through sheer force of will and financial austerity, never let me forget that lesson. Her voice remains a permanent fixture in the back of my mind, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat, never marry a man, you have to rescue Brooke. Integrity isn't something you can teach a grown man. It is the currency he either possesses or he doesn't. When Daniel entered my life, he seemed like the exception. He was ambitious-driven and appeared to respect the intellectual fortress I had built for myself. But about 8 months ago, the mask began to slip in microscopic increments. It started with casual questions about the structure of my family's trust, questions masked as concern for our joint future. He began to suggest that my academic work was a noble hobby, while his ventures were the real engine of our lifestyle. I didn't react with the emotional hurt he probably expected. Instead, I became clinical. I began to audit him as I would a failing subsidiary. I noticed how his eyes lit up, not when I published a groundbreaking paper, but when my attorney mentioned the appreciation of my estate's portfolio. I realized then that Daniel wasn't falling in love with me. He was falling in love with the stability my name provided. He saw me as a strategic acquisition, a way to anchor his volatile ambitions to a foundation of old, reliable money. I knew I needed a definitive test, a way to lure his true intentions out of the shadows and into the light where they could be documented. Under the guise of wedding stress and an overwhelming academic workload, I began the long, calculated process of stalling our legal union. I told him I was too exhausted to finalize the paperwork, while secretly I was coordinating with Arthur to craft a masterwork of legal deception. I presented Daniel with what I called a gesture of trust, a fake co-ownership proposal that looked on the surface like I was handing him the keys to my kingdom. It was a labyrinthine document filled with complex jargon that suggested he would gain significant equity in my family's assets upon our marriage. I knew his greed would be his undoing. Instead of bringing the document to our shared legal counsel, Daniel did exactly what I predicted. He secretly consulted a private lawyer to find loopholes that would allow him to exploit the proposal even further. What he didn't know was that every move he made, every secret consultation, and every bad faith edit his lawyer suggested was being tracked by my team. I was gathering a dossier of his dishonesty, building the necessary evidence to trigger a very specific moral clause in our actual prenuptial agreement, the one he hadn't seen yet. This clause was my masterpiece. In the high-stakes world of estate law, reputation is the ultimate collateral. My moral clause stipulated that any act of public defamation or behavior that caused irreparable harm to the reputation and standing of the sterling name would result in the immediate forfeiture of all spousal claims and the activation of a heavy financial penalty. I didn't need to trap Daniel. I just needed to give him enough rope to hang himself. He was so blinded by the prospect of the wealth he thought he was stealing that he became reckless. He began to treat the suburban estate as if he had already won it. That house, the very one where he had just locked me out in the freezing cold, was a symbol of his arrogance. He paraded through those halls like a conqueror, hosting his seed-round sharks and drinking my father's vintage cellar dry. He truly believed that by Christmas he would be the master of the Sterling estate. The irony which I savored as the limo turned onto the main highway was that the house had never been his to win. Decades ago, my father had placed that property into a family trust with a permitted residency clause. Daniel was essentially a high-end squatter, a guest whose welcome was entirely contingent on my signature. My strategy was never to fight him for the house in a messy divorce court. That would be beneath me. Instead, I had spent the last 3 months quietly preparing to sell the deed of the property to a non-profit organization that specialized in sheltering women from domestic and financial abuse. I had already signed the preliminary intent to sell. While Daniel was inside that house preening for his investors and clutching Alyssa as if she were a trophy, he was standing on ground that was shifting beneath his feet. He was celebrating a kingdom that was already being dismantled. He thought he was exerting dominance by pushing me out into the snow, but he was actually just providing the final televised proof of his breach of the moral clause. He had slandered me in front of 20 high-profile witnesses, effectively triggering the legal mechanism that would leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a massive debt to my family's trust. By midnight, Daniel was celebrating in a house that legally required him to show me respect, a requirement he had just violated in front of 20 witnesses. As the limousine glided further away from the estate, my thoughts shifted from the legal ironwork of the trust to the human element of this betrayal, the woman currently standing by the fire drinking my wine and wearing the smile of a victor. Alyssa was never just a homewrecker in the traditional sense. That term implies a level of emotional chaos that she simply didn't possess. No, Alyssa was a career predator, a young woman who looked at the world not in terms of relationships, but in terms of leveraged buyouts. When I first met her, she was a struggling junior analyst with a mediocre resume and a desperate hunger for proximity to power. I saw a spark of ambition in her, and perhaps fueled by a misguided sense of professional sisterhood, I took her under my wing. I polished her rough edges, edited her reports until they shone with my own intellectual rigor, and introduced her to the high-level networks that took me 15 years to cultivate. I treated her as a protégé, never realizing that she wasn't looking to learn my methods, she was looking to steal my seat. The shift happened about a year ago. I began to notice the way her eyes lingered on Daniel, not with affection, but with the cold, calculating gaze of an investor eyeing a distressed asset. She saw the version of Daniel that I had meticulously built, the polished, confident, and strategically sound version that only existed because of my constant behind-the-scenes management. Instead of firing her when I first sensed the shift in her loyalty, I decided to play a much longer game. I opened the door for her, intentionally creating opportunities for her and Daniel to work closely together on special projects. I essentially handed her a broken toy, allowing her to believe she was winning a prize. I knew that Alyssa's greed would blind her to the reality that Daniel was a hollow vessel. Without my constant guidance, he was nothing more than a collection of expensive suits and rehearsed platitudes. I wanted her to see him through the lens of her own ambition, to let her believe that she could replace me as the power behind the throne. It was a Trojan horse mentorship. I gave her exactly what she wanted, knowing it would eventually be the very thing that destroyed her reputation. The true depth of their treachery became clear to me a few months before the New Year's Eve party. I discovered that their affair wasn't just a romantic betrayal. It was a cold-blooded professional heist. They were auditing me. Daniel and Alyssa had formed an alliance of convenience, working together late into the night to go through my private files and intellectual property. Alyssa was helping Daniel rewrite his major investment proposals, using my proprietary models and research as their own. They thought they were being clever, stealing the blueprints to my kingdom while I was distracted by wedding planning. However, I had anticipated this move. I began accidentally leaving draft documents on my home office desk, proposals for a massive energy infrastructure project that looked flawless on the surface, but contained a fatal, hidden logical flaw in the debt-to-equity projections. I watched through my security feed as Alyssa snapped photos of those documents with her phone, her face lit with the triumphant glow of a thief who thinks they've found the master key. This wasn't a romantic cliché. It was a corporate raid, and I was the one who had rigged the vault. Both of them truly believed they were outsmarting the woman who had taught them everything they knew, never suspecting that the data they were using to build Daniel's future was a ticking time bomb. My response to their betrayal was not one of tears or public confrontation. That would have been a waste of energy. Instead, I executed a quiet, strategic withdrawal. I began to slowly remove the invisible scaffolding that held Daniel's life together. I stopped ghostwriting his speeches for the investment summits. I stopped correcting the subtle errors in his financial models. I stopped making the casual phone calls to my elite contacts to vouch for his credibility or to smooth over his frequent professional blunders. I allowed the Daniel and Alyssa brand to exist entirely on its own merit for the first time. It was a fascinating experiment in slow-motion collapse. I watched as Daniel's confidence, once fueled by my silent labor, began to morph into a dangerous, unearned arrogance. He truly believed he had leveled up and no longer needed my academic rigor or my strategic mind. Alyssa, too, was convinced she had successfully reverse-engineered my success. They were a tower of cards built on a foundation of stolen, flawed intelligence, and I was content to sit back and watch the wind rise. By the time we reached the night of the gala, the cracks were already starting to show, though Daniel was too self-absorbed to notice. He had been using the flawed data I provided to court a group of ultra-conservative institutional investors, men who don't forgive mathematical errors or lack of integrity. He thought he was closing the deal of a lifetime, unaware that he was pitching a fantasy. My withdrawal was complete. I had spent the last few weeks of December simply observing, waiting for the moment Daniel would decide he was powerful enough to discard me. I knew that his ego would eventually demand a grand gesture of dominance, and the New Year's Eve party provided the perfect stage. He wanted to show his investors and Alyssa that he was the one in control, that Brooke Sterling was just a decorative accessory he could lock out in the cold at his whim. He didn't realize that by pushing me out that door, he was cutting the last thread of professional protection he had left. He was finally standing on his own 2 feet, but he was standing on a precipice. The calls from the big firms, the invitations to the exclusive boardrooms, and the nods of approval from the city's power brokers were all tied to my name, not his. By the end of January, Daniel's calls weren't being returned, not because of a scandal, but because the foundation of his intelligence had quietly walked out the door. The weeks following that frozen New Year's Eve were a masterclass in gravitational collapse. For years, I had been the invisible force holding Daniel's professional universe together, a silent architect who reinforced his structural weaknesses before the world could see the cracks. Without my constant intervention, the decay was instantaneous. It began with a subtle, icy shift in the tone of his lead investors. These were men of significant capital and even more significant egos, and they had grown accustomed to a certain level of intellectual depth in Daniel's proposals, a depth that was in reality entirely mine. When he submitted his latest energy infrastructure project, the one he and Alyssa had perfected using my sabotaged data, the response wasn't the usual enthusiastic wire transfer. Instead, it was a flagged report. They noticed the shift in quality, the erratic logic, and the gaping holes in the risk assessment. When the lead investor called for a formal audit of the project's projections, Daniel's first instinct was not to solve the problem, but to reach for his old safety net. He called me 42 times in a single weekend. He sent frantic emails shifting from a tone of faux apology to desperate entitlement, assuming that I would fix the numbers out of some lingering sense of duty or habit. He was finally beginning to realize that I wasn't just a fiancé he could discard to assert his dominance. I was his chief operating officer, his ghostwriter, and his only gatekeeper to the world of real power. By the time he realized I was never picking up the phone again, the audit was already in motion, and his facade of brilliance was beginning to peel away like cheap paint. The climax of his professional unraveling occurred in a boardroom that should have been his sanctuary, but instead became his courtroom. Daniel had been forced to present his project to a new panel of senior consultants to justify why his funding shouldn't be pulled. He walked into the university's conference wing with his chin held high, probably expecting a group of dusty academics he could easily charm. To his absolute horror, he found me sitting at the head of the mahogany table. I wasn't there as his jilted ex-fiancé. I was there in my official capacity as the lead evaluator for the university's venture fund. The silence in the room was heavy thick with the scent of expensive coffee and Daniel's sudden cold sweat. I didn't yell. I didn't show a flicker of personal resentment. I remained perfectly professional, a scholar dissecting a flawed thesis. I allowed him to stumble through his opening remarks before I leaned forward and asked 3 devastatingly simple questions about his financial projections. I asked about the debt-to-equity ratio in the third quarter, the logical inconsistency in his carbon credit arbitrage, and the source of his primary data. These were the exact gaps I had intentionally left in the documents on my desk, the traps I knew his arrogance wouldn't allow him to verify. Daniel fumbled his face, turning a mottled shade of red as he looked toward the door, as if hoping for a miracle. He realized in that moment that I hadn't set a trap in the traditional sense. I had simply stopped holding his hand and let him walk off the cliff he had built for himself. As the board members exchanged grim, knowing looks, the second phase of my strategy moved into position. My personal attorney Arthur entered the room with a calm, predatory grace. He wasn't there to discuss the investment. He was there to finalize the dissolution of our legal and financial ties. In front of the university's board members, the very peers whose respect Daniel had spent years trying to cultivate, Arthur played the security footage from the night of the -12 degrees Celsius exile. The room watched in stunned silence as the high-definition video showed Daniel pushing me out into the sub-zero darkness and locking the door with a sneer of triumph. It was the definitive proof of public disrepute, a direct violation of the moral clause in our filings. This wasn't just a personal failing, it was a character audit that proved he was a liability to any institution associated with him. The board members, many of whom were the wives and colleagues of his primary investors, looked at Daniel with a mixture of disgust and pity. By treating me as a subordinate to be punished, he had triggered the legal mechanism that stripped him of every severance or settlement he had planned to use to keep his failing business afloat. He had expected a lucrative exit. Instead, he was being escorted out of the building of his own reputation. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood there clutching a leather portfolio that contained nothing but flawed data and broken promises, looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. He had spent months believing Alyssa was his new strategic partner, convinced that she could provide the same intellectual fuel I had given him for years. But Alyssa was nowhere to be found in that boardroom. She was a predator who followed the scent of success, and Daniel currently smelled like a sinking ship. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friend, or even a sympathetic glance, but found only the cold, professional judgment of the world he had tried so hard to conquer. He had thought that locking me out in the cold was an act of dominance, a way to show everyone that he was the master of his domain. Instead, it was the most expensive mistake of his life, a public demonstration of a lack of integrity that no amount of money could fix. He had traded a partner of substance for a shadow of ambition, and the bill had finally come due. As he fumbled for an answer in the silence of the boardroom, Daniel realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who knew how to make him look like a genius. The silence following Daniel's catastrophic boardroom failure lasted only as long as it took for me to move into my new administrative suite at the university. A week later, the visual reversal of our lives was complete. I stood behind my floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the manicured courtyard when my assistant informed me that a Mr. Grayson was in the lobby requesting a moment of my time. He didn't have an appointment. For 3 years, Daniel had lived as the self-appointed master of the house, a man who never had to wait for anything because I was always 3 steps ahead clearing his path. Now he sat on a stiff, mid-century modern chair in a public hallway clutching a lukewarm paper cup of coffee, waiting for my permission to speak. When I finally allowed him into my office, he looked diminished. The expensive Italian suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, and the arrogance that usually radiated from him had been replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. He didn't offer a greeting. He launched immediately into an accusation claiming that I had set him up, that I had sabotaged his career out of spite. I let him finish his tirade, watching him with the same detached curiosity I would use to observe a failing market trend. When he finally ran out of breath, I calmly explained my philosophy of governance. A partner who cannot be trusted to stand with you in the cold cannot be trusted with the keys to the kingdom. I told him that I hadn't set a trap. I had simply stopped protecting him from himself. Then I handed him the final legal document that would sever his connection to my life forever. I revealed that the suburban estate, the one he had so triumphantly locked me out of, had been donated to a local women's shelter foundation. I had processed the donation in his name, a final gift that ensured he would receive a significant charitable tax break to soften the blow of his impending bankruptcy. He stared at the deed in horror as he realized that while he had been trying to win a house, I had been busy transforming it into a sanctuary for the very type of woman he tried to break. He was losing the roof over his head, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. As Daniel's professional world crumbled, the alliance he thought he had built with Alyssa evaporated with clinical efficiency. Alyssa was never a woman driven by the messy complications of love. She was a creature of pure transaction. She had hitched her wagon to Daniel because she believed his star was rising and that he was the vessel through which she would gain access to the elite circles she craved. The moment my withdrawal caused his funding to dry up and the boardroom doors to slam shut, her devotion vanished like mist in the sun. She realized that she hadn't stolen a king. She had inherited a liability. Her exit was as cold and calculated as her entry. When she discovered that I had formally blacklisted her from the university's entire professional and alumni network for ethical violations and intellectual property theft, she didn't stay to fight or plead her case. She knew the game was over. I watched the security footage of her leaving the apartment they had secretly shared. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. She simply packed her designer bags and moved on to the next potential mark. Daniel was left truly alone in the wreckage of a reputation that was currently being dissected by every major investor in the city. He had sacrificed everything for a partner who viewed him as nothing more than a temporary bridge to a destination she would now never reach. Our final conversation took place in the quiet, echoing hallway outside my office. Daniel was desperate, his voice cracking as he tried to pivot back to the romance we had shared, begging me to remember the man he used to be. I stopped him with a single look. I told him that this wasn't about heartbreak, it was about an audit. In business, an audit reveals the true value of an asset once the fluff and marketing are stripped away. I explained that marriage at its core is a partnership of character, and his had been found severely wanting. Then I gave him the piece of information that I knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. I revealed that the gesture of trust document I had given him months ago, the one he had secretly tried to exploit with his own lawyers, was a mirror of a real transfer agreement I had drafted. I told him that if he had stayed outside with me that night, or even just had the basic human decency to bring me a coat, I would have signed the real papers the next morning. I would have transferred 30% of my private holdings into a joint account for our future. He had been inches away from the very fortune he tried so hard to steal, but his need to exert dominance, his fragile ego had blinded him to the gold mine standing right in front of him. He had traded a lifetime of generational wealth and a partner of immense influence for the fleeting, cheap thrill of locking a door on a woman he thought was beneath him. He stood there, the weight of his own greed finally crushing him. He tried to speak to offer some justification or a last-ditch apology, but the words died in his throat. He looked at me, truly, looked at me and saw a woman who was no longer his ghostwriter or his safety net. He saw the dean of a world he no longer belonged to, and a consultant who had just successfully liquidated his future. I turned my back on him and walked toward my desk, the click of my heels on the marble floor, the only sound in the room. I had spent years making him look like a giant, only to realize that he was a small man who had simply been standing on my shoulders. As he exited the lobby, a ghost in a world of giants, he finally understood the lesson I had been trying to teach him all along. For the first time, he understood that respect isn't demanded through a locked door. It is earned long before the winter sets in. The weeks following Daniel's final departure from my office were marked by a profound, clarifying silence that allowed me to finally hear the rhythm of my own ambitions. I officially stepped into my role as the Dean of the International Economics and Leadership Program, a position that carried a weight and prestige Daniel could never have understood. In my inaugural address, I didn't present myself as a woman who had survived a scandalous betrayal or a victim of a cruel fiancé. Instead, I used my experience as a high-stakes case study in what I call strategic self-defense. I spoke to a room full of brilliant, aspiring leaders about the necessity of auditing the people in their lives with the same rigor they apply to their balance sheets. My rise to the top of the university's administration wasn't just a career milestone. It was the ultimate silent revenge. It was a life lived so exceptionally well that Daniel Grayson was rapidly shrinking from a central figure in my world to a mere cautionary footnote in my biography. To ensure my experience served a greater purpose, I launched the Integrity Scholarship. This fund was specifically dedicated to women who were navigating the treacherous waters of rebuilding their lives after financial or emotional betrayal. Women who, like me, had been the silent architects of someone else's success only to be discarded when they were no longer convenient. Seeing these women reclaim their power and their voices became the most rewarding investment of my career, proving that a legacy built on character is the only asset that truly appreciates over time. 1 year has passed since that night on the stone porch, and as the anniversary arrived, the world felt fundamentally different. I spent this New Year's Eve in my new home, a quiet, sun-drenched brownstone that holds an atmosphere of genuine warmth and intellectual peace. There were no flashing cameras, no desperate investors to impress, and no grand galas designed to feed a fragile man's ego. I was surrounded only by my true inner circle friends and colleagues who value me for my mind, not for the doors I can open for them. There were no deadbolts to fear, and no doors to lock. As the clock approached midnight, I sat by the fireplace and reflected on the night of the -12 degrees Celsius exile. I realized then that the brutal temperature of that evening had never been the true problem. The cold hadn't come from the Canadian air or the swirling snow. It had come from the atmosphere of deceit that had permeated my life for far too long. By standing my ground in the snow, I had finally broken the generational cycle of my father's trauma. I had taken the wreckage of his shattered trust and my mother's hardened caution and forged them into a fortress of wisdom that would protect me for the rest of my days. I was no longer guarding a kingdom for a king who didn't deserve it. I was the sovereign of my own life. Earlier today, while organizing some digital files, I came across a photo taken by a neighbor's security camera on that infamous night. It showed a woman in a thin emerald silk dress standing alone in the shadows of a grand estate while a storm raged around her. For a long time, I had looked at that image and felt a pang of lingering anger, but today I saw someone entirely different. I saw a woman who wasn't freezing, but a woman who was finally defrosting from the numbing effects of a toxic relationship. I realized in that moment that my value had never been tied to the man standing on the other side of the glass, nor was it defined by the diamond ring I had eventually returned to its box. My value was rooted in the integrity I refused to surrender, even when the world told me to play the part of the submissive partner. I looked at that woman in the snow and smiled, knowing that she was the one who had possessed the keys all along. I am no longer just a survivor of a public humiliation or a scholar of economic trends. I am the architect of my own peace, a woman who understands that the most valuable estate one can ever own is a clear conscience and an unshakable sense of self. The house Daniel once claimed as his own is now a bustling center for women's advocacy, its halls filled with the sounds of transformation rather than the hollow clinking of champagne flutes. Daniel himself has become a ghost of the city's financial district, a man whose name is whispered as a warning to young associates about the dangers of arrogance and the high cost of a bad character. As the first snow of this new year began to fall outside my window, coating the streets of the city in a clean white slate, I felt a sense of closure that no court settlement or public apology could ever provide. I have built a life that is weatherproof, anchored by a foundation of truth that no winter storm can crack. I reached out and turned off the lamp, letting the soft glow of the city lights fill the room. I thought back to the moment the limo door clicked shut, ending one chapter and beginning the one that actually mattered. The temperature that night was minus 12 degrees Celsius, but the coldest thing in that house had never been the winter. It had been the absence of integrity. I hope Brooke Sterling's journey of reclaiming justice and asserting her identity has provided you with moments of profound reflection on the value of self-respect and independence. This story is not just a sweet taste of revenge, but a powerful reminder that a woman's most precious assets are the intellect and integrity that no one can ever take away. What do you think about Brooke's decision to transform a house filled with painful memories into a sanctuary for other women? Or do you believe the punishment Daniel received was truly enough? Please share your thoughts and any similar stories you've witnessed in the comments below so we can continue the discussion. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next real-life drama designed to inspire and empower. Your support and engagement are what drive us to keep creating high-quality content for women of character and strength everywhere. Thank you for listening until the very end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story where justice is always served in the most unexpected ways.